Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, July 18th, 2025, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2028 presidential election prediction. Earlier on today, I was thinking that I hadn't made one of these videos in a while, and I decided that I wanted to do another type of candidate. I've done Josh Shapiro, I've done some other candidates too, looking at a potential rematch in 2028, and I've even looked and explored the very heavy on unrealistic possibility that Donald Trump runs for a third term. So I thought it would be standard today to talk about a real hypothetical 2028 matchup, and that's between Vice President J.D. Vance, who currently stands to be the frontrunner in the 2028 presidential election on the Republican side, and Governor Wes Moore from the state of Maryland. My governor, my home state. I'm a huge fan of the state of Maryland, so I thought it would be timely today to take a look at a 2028 matchup between Wes Moore and J.D. Vance. So, these election predictions have been run the same way for a very long time, and that really isn't going to change much. If you're new to these election predictions, you might not know that we do a ratings system that is in the comment section down below, actually in the description box, but we go with safe, likely, lean, and tilt states. And as is the case with all of the videos that we start off with, we do all of the safe states for the Democratic Party and safe states for the Republican Party. So these are states that would be decided by 15 points or more in favor of one political party. And so we start off with the Democrats at roughly about 147, I would say 148. Illinois, I would also move over there to about 167 electoral votes that at baseline, Democrats are probably going to be winning by margins of 15 points or more. After the last election, New Jersey no longer joins that bunch as a standard safe Democratic state. It was decided by about 5.9% in the last election. Way too close for comfort for the Democratic Party. And it certainly means that it will probably be about 10 to 15 points in favor of the Democratic Party in the next cycle should they see some reversion amongst key demographic groups that they rely on for support and victory. But Jersey is still going to be a Democratic state. You'll see it in a moment. Go to the Democratic Party and go to Governor Wes Moore. But we're starting off with about 167 electoral votes in favor of the Democratic Party. Now, looking at J.D. Vance, I'd also argue too, actually, looking at the electoral map here, Democrats don't really compete in many of these other states either. A lot of the states that I'm characterizing in favor of J.D. Vance as solid for the GOP have been that way for quite some time. These are states like Mississippi and Tennessee and Montana where we can pretty much just say with beyond reasonable doubt that the Republican Party is going to do quite well in these states. Now, the only ones that are of points of interest to me are states like Kansas and South Carolina that often border the edge of being states that are likely. Back in 2020, Kansas actually narrowed down to being 14.6%, and I know that doesn't seem like it is really a likely state, but it certainly was. And even in 2024, we also saw that with Nebraska's first district, that Trump won by 13. In 2020, he won it by 14.9, which is the reason why I also haven't characterized it as safe for the GOP. And South Carolina, back in 2020, was decided by about 11.7%. Under Obama, was decided by 10.5 and 9 points. And so there's a reason why we don't always characterize it immediately as a safe Republican state. And so starting off the bat here, we have the Republicans and J.D. Vance at about 106 electoral votes nationwide. But don't let this deceive you. The Republican Party has some huge electoral prizes that they will get in just a moment when we move down to likely Republican states like Texas and Florida that will skyrocket their number very close to where they need to be in competitive territory in the next election. But the interesting thing I think about Wes Moore in the next election cycle is that I think he would have a pretty strong ability at driving up turnout amongst key demographic groups that Democrats, again, rely on constantly in election after election. When I'm thinking about Wes Moore in the last time he ran for office was 2022, he'll be up again in 2026, so we can do a revised version of this in about 2 years. But Wes Moore ran for governor and did actually quite well, not just in the Democratic primary, but also in the general election. In the last presidential prior to that race, Joe Biden had won the state of Maryland by about 33.2%. But 2 years later, the approval rating of Biden had plummeted, the midterm environment was not conducive to Democratic victories, and while Maryland is a pretty solid Democratic state, Wes Moore did very well, especially given the national shift did not match the shift we saw in Maryland. And a lot of that was in part to the fact that Wes Moore was able to drive up turnout, specifically amongst Black Americans in the state of Maryland, also, too, amongst Hispanic voters across the state. We saw that Wes Moore really was driving up those numbers on the margins in exit polling data and actual performance amongst key demographic groups, again, that are necessary and conducive to a Democratic Party victory that was holding up to the margin that it was in 2020, despite the national environment shifting about 8 points towards the Republican Party, which means states like South Carolina, I do think that has a huge portion of its voting electorate that are Black Americans. I do think that Wes Moore would outpace where Kamala Harris was in the last election and probably be on par with that of Biden's in 2020, which would bring South Carolina to being a likely Republican state. Here comes the segue into the likely red states. I also think, too, states like Alaska and Texas and Florida that have been pretty historically likely for the Republican Party, especially in the last presidential and the last midterm cycle. These 3 states are going to go to J.D. Vance. I don't know if Wes Moore is going to be able to narrow up these states to the degree that would be necessary to make them competitive on the presidential level. Florida seems to be a bit too far gone for the National Democratic Party. Texas, I think, would be closer than Florida. Actually, they were roughly nearly identical in terms of margin. In the last election, Florida was decided by 13. Texas was decided by 14. Alaska was decided by 14. I think that Wes Moore would narrow them up. I think Florida would still be about 12 to 13 points. Texas, I could see moving down to about 8 or 9 points. But the massive reversion that we saw in favor of the GOP will take a lot longer than just one presidential election cycle to fix, and certainly a lot longer than this upcoming midterm. But we can talk about that because circumstances can really change races practically overnight. But as of right now, I think J.D. Vance stands to be at about 188 electoral votes and counting across this map. Kansas would also be a likely red state. I think that Nebraska's first, as it was in 2024, would also go back to being a likely Republican state. I'd also still say that Iowa and Ohio are largely out of reach for the Democratic Party. Ohio was decided by 11. Iowa was decided by 13. So generally speaking, I'm not as confident that Democrats can really reel back in these states that they otherwise were able to do in 2008 or 2012, and even with a candidate who I do think would be much stronger than most of the potential nominees for Democrats in 2028, that being Governor Wes Moore, I still don't think many of these states are within reach, nor do I think that they should be primary targets, especially with the electoral map that has evolved quite a bit over the past cycle, with New Jersey being included and a more focus on the South and the Sun Belt rather than other portions of the Midwestern region that might have been otherwise competitive in previous Democratic presidencies. And so looking at the remaining 153 electoral votes here, I do think also, too, Wes Moore really does bring back some of those voters in the white working class. I think especially young men. You'd find that Wes Moore does have a unique appeal to, with military background, also to just the way of speaking. I think when you take a look at the way Wes Moore has campaigned over the past 3.5 years, 2022 included, you'll see that style of campaigning is not standard, as you might have seen with some other Democrats, not just in the past, but also those who are actively vying for the presidency in 2028. And so I do think that it'd be interesting to see, Wes Moore on the national stage, because I do think he has a unique appeal that really extends to a lot of different voters in a way that I don't think J.D. Vance has all the juice as Donald Trump. But there are some ways, too, that J.D. Vance does have a bit more of an appeal than Donald Trump might have had. There might be some voters in states like Georgia that were McCain and Romney and then held their nose and voted for Trump in 2016, but then were in for Biden in 2020 and might not have voted in 2024. That J.D. Vance might be able to win back some of these voters. But as it pertains to the states that we've discussed thus far, I do think Wes Moore actually narrows up every single state that we've characterized in favor of the margin for him and the Democratic Party, but it doesn't mean that Democrats are going to win these states. Now, moving on to some states that I'd characterize as likely for the Democratic Party, you have quite a bit too. Colorado, New Mexico. Colorado, I could see veering on the edge of being a safe Democratic state, but for now, I'll wait until 2026 before I make some characterizations around it. I'd say Colorado right now, likely for the Democrats. New Mexico, likely for the Democrats. Virginia, New Jersey. I'd even go so far as to say Maine, we already knew is going to be likely for the Democrats. I'd even say I do think that Donald Trump's appeal in New Hampshire in 2024 was largely a reversion of a lot of the support that we saw for Harris, but it was nullified in this state, if that makes sense, compared to what the national shift was. Coming off the last presidential, Joe Biden won by 4.5. Coming on into this presidential, we saw Harris lost the popular vote by 1.5, so about a 6-point swing in about 4 years. New Hampshire did not swing by 6 points. I think Wes Moore would be able to win this state by a likely Democratic margin. It move it up to 215. I'd also argue that Minnesota would be another likely Democratic state. I also think J.D. Vance actually has not so great of a Midwestern appeal that we might think. He's been a chronic underperformer. He didn't add much to the ticket in 2024, and I just don't think he's overall perceived that positively, especially compared to Donald Trump. He has lower approval rating than Donald Trump in Ohio. He didn't have a high approval rating and only really won because of the circumstances around the state being so in favor of the GOP. He won by less than Trump in all 3 of the elections that Trump won in 2016, in 2020, in 2024, and a big reason for that was because voters really didn't like J.D. Vance. He was the most unpopular candidate out of the four that were running on a ticket in 2024, Tim Walz, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, and of course, J.D. Vance included, and that matters. That makes a difference, and it persuades voters towards you or against you in the case of Ohio, and I think in the case of many other states too, especially when placed head-to-head against Wes Moore, more so in the negative for J.D. Vance. It benefits the Democrats in many of these states, which is why I think that now we move into the final battleground states. And now this feels a lot similar to the 2024 election. The same battleground states, the same states to be vied for. I think that Nebraska's second moves over to being likely for the Democratic Party. I don't, however, believe that Maine's 2nd District would be likely for the GOP. I think we'd see J.D. Vance lose some support here, especially amongst rural voters and really excited voters that might not necessarily be getting out there and saying, I'm now voting for the Democratic Party, but they might not be voting at all. I think Donald Trump tapped into a very, very important part of the base, which were low-propensity voters. Voters that did not engage regularly with the news cycle, that did not engage regularly with political topics of conversation, and didn't really involve themselves in primary elections or midterm elections or special elections or off-cycle elections, but turned out in presidential elections, but not for any strange reasons. They turned out for Donald Trump. And I don't think J.D. Vance is going to have that same appeal. I think Wes Moore, too, is going to counteract that. I think he's going to peel away at the portions of voters that vote for J.D. Vance amongst male voters that were key in Donald Trump's victory in the last election. I think that J.D. Vance is going to see a regression in terms of support amongst minority voters. Donald Trump was inching towards it. I don't think J.D. Vance continues inching towards that. I think Donald Trump, again, had a very unique appeal that is not going to be replicated by J.D. Vance. Maybe somebody else can do it. I don't think that the sitting vice president is going to be the one to do so. And so in these remaining 93 electoral votes, I think there will be some residual support for J.D. Vance, especially in states that Donald Trump did very well in the last election. For instance, Arizona is a state that I still think J.D. Vance would win in the next presidential, largely because Donald Trump won it by 6 points, and in terms of support here, you would have to see massive amounts change amongst key Latino voters in Arizona, in contrast to some other states where you would see minor reversions, that on the margins supplemented by a change in the tides amongst male voters, younger voters, and white voters could benefit Wes more, that it would flip the state. I don't know if you're getting a 6-point shift in Arizona, at least not right now. And so J.D. Vance, I think, stands to be, within reason, able to win in Arizona. But in some of these other states, I wouldn't be as confident. Now, at baseline, I actually do think that Wes Moore could defeat J.D. Vance in this election, and I think he'd be the favorite to do so. I think Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania would vote for Wes Moore over J.D. Vance. I think especially, too, when you're thinking about those low-propensity voters that turn out in elections, when you think about 2024 and 2020 and 2016, the big reason why Donald Trump was significantly outpacing Romney and McCain was, again, a lot of those voters that might have felt apathetic about Romney or McCain and also might have voted for Obama came out in full force in 16 and arguably, too, in 2020 and 2024. I think 2020 was the election that really showed the true power of Donald Trump's electoral strength, even though he lost the election. It showed that in an environment where all the odds arguably were stacked up against an incumbent president who was facing a pandemic that arguably was exacerbated by the lack of federal response and Donald Trump's inaction on the global stage. But looking still at the electoral stage, Donald Trump actually did better than many of us expected. And so that should have been a warning sign, too, in 2024 for some Democrats that even in the face of adversity, even in the face of everything really being in favor of Joe Biden, that it was Donald Trump who was able to keep some of these margins down. And again, I don't see J.D. Vance as that candidate. And so Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, I think, drive around more towards Wes Moore. I do think overall turnout on the national stage would be lower than 2024. But I do think Wes Moore ultimately comes out ahead, and I do think that he would defeat J.D. Vance in the next presidential cycle. But now we come down to these three remaining states. I think on the margins, J.D. Vance would find that he narrowly ekes by in Nevada. But in North Carolina and in Georgia, I think Wes Moore wins these states. I think it brings him to 302 electoral votes. It's a margin of victory that is pretty substantive for the governor of Maryland. And also, too, looking at where it is, 302 to 236, anything above 270, which is what is necessary to win, is a huge win for the Democratic Party because they get the White House back. I think North Carolina and Georgia, too, are also unique points of interest for me personally. Looking at these two states, especially the percentage of minority population and specifically the percentage of black voting population in these two states is significantly higher than in many other battleground states, especially in contrast with states on the western side of the United States and arguably, too, even the Rust Belt. And that's where I think Wes Moore's cross-appeal really does blend in. Does better amongst a bunch of different constituencies. And while this isn't saying that, Wes Moore is going to win 30% of Trump voters, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is on the margins and amongst those winnable voters that have actually swung back and forth. I mean, a lot of these states voted for Biden in 2020, then for Trump in 2024, and are voting again in this hypothetical for Wes Moore in 2028. These things happen because the map is dynamic and voters are dynamic too. And I do think Wes Moore fundamentally is a stronger candidate than most Democrats who are running for office in 2028, who we will see run for office in 2028. And I think at baseline, Wes Moore defeats J.D. Vance in a hypothetical 2028 matchup and brings forth, yes, a competitive race. But flipping back for the Democratic Party, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina for the first time since Obama in 2008, 20 years prior to this election, and the state of Georgia. And while Arizona and Nevada might be gone in theory in this hypothetical for the Democratic Party, Wes Moore still pulls out ahead. He wins the presidency, and I think he does quite well, and again, stands to be one of the best performing Democrats in the next election cycle. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2028 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.